Good morning.
Morning.
Okay, so this is first time we're gonna cover public finance part of the course. So let me introduce myself. My name is Zuzana Brixiova, and I will be instructor for this course. As far as my background, I come mostly so far from non-academia. I worked for International Monetary Fund, OECD, and also for the credit rating agency Moody's. And then last year I was teaching in Ostrava, and from September I moved here to Prague. So I will be covering this course, and we can start. Normally when I'm in the class, I ask people to introduce themselves a little bit, but I think online, or do we want to do that because there are not so many people right now? So do people want to go around and introduce themselves? And why are you studying the course? What do you expect to get out of this part of the course? Anyone wants to say something, please do so. So we're meeting online. It will be an experiment, but I think, I believe this can be equally effective, and at least we will get more used to operating in this type of mode. So as far as office hours, I normally have them on Wednesday from 1 to 4. But if you have questions, just send me an email, or we can set up time on Teams to talk some other time as well. So let me start now with the first lecture. Now, since this online, my experience is this is not as interactive as in class. Sometimes the lecture may be a little bit shorter than it would be in class. Simply, it's the same lecture, but in class there is more discussion. So, but anyway, let's try to have as much as discussion as possible. Can you see the PPT now?
Yes.
Okay. So we start with overview now, and basically we'll ask what is public finance and why is it a topic that we should be studying. And again, I would really appreciate if we can have a little bit of discussion. Before we do that, let me just mention some of the reading. So mandatory, but this is Gruber, Public Finance and Public Policy, the latest edition, and then also Hillman, same title, but different. It's political economy perspective on the topic. And sometimes macroeconomics, but that's really only for very specific parts of the course. So I would not worry so much about that. So let's now talk about what is public finance. So there are 4 key questions that public finance, public economics is trying to answer. So when should the government intervene in the economy? And if it decides it should intervene, that there is a reason why the government should intervene, how it should do so. And then what are the economic effects of intervention? We should also ask always what are the economic costs, and of course we compare the effects and the costs of the intervention. And then why do governments do things the way they do them? So this is very specific. What is public finance trying to do? Maybe before we go further, we can think about a little bit about public finance as a science. So when we think about sciences very broadly, what type of sciences do we have? You study economics, right? You're at the Prague University of Economics. So economics as such, into what group of sciences does it fall?
Microeconomics and macroeconomics.
Those would be, it's correct what you're saying, but those would be subcategories. So if we want to categorize economics as such more specifically, then you are right. The key areas would be micro and macro. But now we want to actually lump economics with other sciences. So other sciences, for example, physics or chemistry, that's example of the science, or sociology, psychology. With which of these sciences would you group economics? Would you group it with physics, mathematics, or would you group it with sociology, for example?
Social science.
Exactly. I cannot hear you so as well, so if you can speak a bit louder, but what you said, it's correct. It's a social science. So key objective of this group of sciences is to study the behavior of people. And that's, of course, in some sense more difficult and less rigorous than the hard sciences like physics. Because in society, you know, to establish causality in economics is much more difficult, because to have neat experiments, it doesn't lend the field to neat experiments as physics. Chemistry you can take to laboratory, design very clear condition, and you can establish causality. If I do this, this is what follows. Now in economics, in recent years, there have been many experiments. And in fact, last Nobel Prize winner, does anyone know who has won the Nobel Prize half a year ago or a couple months ago? Or rather, for what did the people win the Nobel Prize? So it was exactly for economic experiments. Now, problem with economic experiments that if we take people into the lab, we may establish very specific situation, but it's very difficult to generalize for the rest of the economy. So we have causality. If we study surveys, we can have information on the whole economy, but it's difficult to establish causality because there are many other factors that matter than the particle factor. So anyway, but main point here is economics is a social science, but the science is important here. So if it's science, it has theoretical part and this has empirical part. Until recently, most Nobel Prize winners were on the side of theory, but with availability of data more and more, there is put emphasis on empirics. So it's difficult to have good research today without empirical component. So public finance is then part of economics. So public finance is also social science. Public finance, though, we can also put into financial economics or finance as such. So it can also be part of the field of management. That's how you will find it. So it's a little bit of multidisciplinary field. So it's a field that tries to understand the proper role of the government in the economy. Now we often focus on revenue and expenditures of the public budget. So questions that we tend to ask on expenditure sides, what should the government fund really? So what should be the volume and the composition of the expenditures? And then on taxation side, or more broadly revenue side, what is the most efficient way for the government to raise money, but more also what is the fair way to raise money? We can talk about this a little bit more concretely. Now, public finance is not, for example, a field like monetary policy. This is particularly important. So when we talk about fiscal policy, sometimes people say, you know, that's when the government determines the interest rate. No, it's the central bank that sets the interest rate, and setting the policy rate or the interest rate of the central bank is part of monetary policy. It is not part of fiscal policy or part of public finance. Now, fiscal policy can impact the interest rate by government borrowing, but very rarely that is the main goal of the fiscal policy. So now we can talk a little bit about public and private ownership. And we can talk also about different types of economies. So what type of economic systems do we have, in the world? What can we observe? And by that we mean, for example, how much government ownership is there in the economy, and how important is the market in terms of determining people's actions. So do people act according to the plan, or do people act because of market forces? So what type of economic systems, the basic economic systems, can we observe?
Central planned economy.
That would be
Free
one.
market.
Yeah, perfect. So those are the two really basic ones. Now, in the real world, we actually do not see perfectly centrally planned economy, and we also do not see perfectly like pure market economy. So even in the most centrally planned economies, we will find market, and maybe it's so-called gray market or underground economy, but there is a market. And of course, you do not remember, but if you will speak to your parents, they will remember the central planning in the Czech Republic, or they may remember, and the experience they had. And certainly there was a gray market, for example, for foreign exchange, since the exchange rate at the time was, the official one was so out of the actual value, you know, what people were willing to buy for the foreign exchange, then there was another market where one could purchase foreign exchange at much higher price. And so it was with other scarce goods. Now, in a market, again, there is no economy where there would be no government ownership or no government intervention in the economy. So it's just a matter of degree, but it helps from conceptual point of view to think of these two extremes and then to realize our economies are somewhere on the spectrum. Usually the United States or UK are given as example of economies where market plays a decisive role. And then, of course, in the past, you know, but today, centrally planned economies probably closest would be perhaps, you know, Belarus or North Korea. But having said that, we know actually very little about how North Korean economy functions. So maybe better to speak about Belarus, where central planning and state ownership and government control really matter. But among advanced economies, France, for example, would be example of economy where public ownership is highly important, and government provides a lot of guarantees to its citizens. But anyway, key point here is, you know, government has some ownership and some role in every economy, and we will focus here on that part of the economy. So then, public finance we can define as specific financial relation that arise in any economy, because every economy is mixed economy, between public sector entities and private sector entities. And I would also say, let's not forget that public finance are also relations between public sector entities themselves. So can someone give us example of public sector entities and the financial relations between them or among them? So, for example, relations between central government and regional government and the financial relations, the transfer from central budget to the local budget, those would be example of public finance relations between public sector entities. And similarly, any financial relation between government budget and public enterprise would be example of public finance. Now, usually people think about, here I'm going to just deviate or maybe go a little bit more in depth. People think about public finances as transferring the money. So expenditures and revenues, those are the key elements of public finance. But there is also something called contingent government liabilities. And in real life, these actually matter hugely, and they are part of public finance. Can someone explain to us what do we mean by contingent government contingent liabilities? What is it?
Liabilities that are ongoing.
Pardon me?
Liabilities that are ongoing from the government.
Yes.
Like
So
long-term.
Yeah, that's right. So, but example would be, for example, so liability is obviously like debt or something that the government has to pay. But contingent means it happens only in certain circumstances. So, for example, if let's talk about South Africa, Eskom, but you can relate it to the Czech Republic, similar situation. So Eskom is a major electricity supplier in the country. So if Eskom will go bankrupt, it would be a huge problem for the economy and for the consumers. So it's one of these examples too big to fail. And it's reasonable to believe government would never allow it to go bankrupt. But Eskom is carrying on its own financial management and financial relations, and it borrows. But if Eskom would get into financial difficulties, could not repay its debt, and there would be threat that the Eskom can go bankrupt, then government would step in and cover the liabilities of Eskom. So this is a contingent liability. It may be that for years, government does not need to do anything, but it needs to follow Eskom's debt and always think, what is the probability that Eskom will go bankrupt? Because if Eskom goes bankrupt, there is an immediate liability. So, and you can think of you can think of natural disaster, you can actually think about the current pandemic. Obviously, there are a lot of expenses from the government budget that are suddenly happening that would not be happening otherwise. So it's an expenditure contingent on the event. If there is a flood in the Czech Republic in 5 years, again, it's a contingent liability of the government. The other and very costly example of contingent liability would be financial sector difficulties, so that there may be run and some of the banks may go bankrupt. So again, in order to prevent such situation, the government may step in and provide financial assistance to banks. Now, this is really like extreme measure, and it's really the last resort. And the government does not really want to provide huge assurances it will do so, because that reduces incentives. If the banks know, if I'm bankrupt, government will come and bail me out, well, why worry about being bankrupt? Nothing bad will really happen. So it's a fine line between providing security and providing incentives. But I wanted to give this example, so please keep in mind that public finance are the direct expenditures that you see in the budget, but then there is also item, and actually it's monitored by Eurostat, so we can find, and actually I will put it in one of the exercises, voluntary exercises to look at. So it's possible to find, what the contingent liabilities are, and they are being monitored. And it's also then telling us about fiscal situation. So two countries may have exactly the same headline deficit, and they may have the same public sector debt relative to GDP, but if their contingent liabilities are very different of the government, then their fiscal stability or sustainability position is also quite different. Okay, so this is we already said, and so here in public finance, we will study how the government raises its revenues, how does it spend the money, and what is the impact. Maybe here is a reasonable question. Can somebody tell us what is a budgetary policy and what is a fiscal policy? Now, they both are part of public finance, but what is the difference between the two? You can pick any of the two and start with whatever you're more comfortable with. So either public finance or fiscal policy or budgetary policy. And we will repeat these terms throughout a few times, so no problem. So if we think of budgetary policy again, so both have, focus on revenues and expenditures, but really focus of budgetary policy is to ensure that there is enough money to carry out the public finance objectives. So budgetary policy is concerned about revenues and is there sufficient amount of revenues to cover the expenditures. So budgetary policy always will take also medium-term perspective. Is there enough revenues this year, but also is the revenue source sustainable? When we think of sustainable revenue source, example again could be, for example, in developing countries that rely a lot on natural resources. So if proceeds from oil amount for major part of the revenues, that of course it's a highly vulnerable source of revenue, because with rapid fall in oil prices that we saw until actually yesterday, the price went up again a little bit, but anyway, before that we saw a huge decline in oil prices. That of course impacts the revenue of such country. Now, fiscal policy, that really I hope you would answer. So what is the goal of fiscal policy? So basically, from budgetary policy perspective, people who focus on budgetary policy, they do not like to see deficits very much, because that causes them concern. Where do we raise the revenues going forward to keep all this sustainable? Now, fiscal policy, what is the difference? Did anyone take the course on fiscal policy here? Remember, so fiscal policy deals with macroeconomics. As someone here correctly said, economics we can divide into micro and macro. So fiscal policy predominantly focuses on macroeconomics. And then the difference between budgetary policy and fiscal policy is that the budgetary policy focuses on the financial aspects. Fiscal policy really actually focuses on the macroeconomic variable it wants to impact in the economy. So real GDP growth and unemployment. Now, it does not focus on inflation. The policy, macroeconomic policy that focuses on inflation is monetary policy. So really, objective of fiscal policy is not to impact inflation. Perhaps what the fiscal policy may try to do is not to counteract actions of central bank of monetary policy, but goal of inflation is outside of the mandate of fiscal policy. Okay, any questions at this point? Oh, I've already mentioned that the two key tools in public finance, just like in economics, is theory, the theoretical part. So based on that, we provide guide to welfare assessment. What is welfare? We can think of welfare as well-being, and usually when we talk about welfare assessment of public finance, we are trying to see the welfare of the entire economy, not of particular individual. Of course, that's the important part of it, but we aggregate all the individuals. And this is, by the way, we will study later on, why we have different welfare functions, because how we aggregate the individuals will then impact our welfare assessment. So just to give a quick example, at this point, we can aggregate that we simply add all individuals, and the aggregate welfare is the summation of simple adding of the welfare of the individual welfares. We can also put different weights on different individuals. So that would be another example. Or it can be society that cares about its poorest segments. So it's a different type of welfare function, because what really matters is how well off or poorly off are the poorest segments of the society. But how do we measure welfare, by the way? How would you, if somebody asks you, how would you measure welfare in a country?
GDP?
Yes, that's one traditional way, and we certainly would include it. That would be probably the first point, starting point. Any other?
I think you could also look at the services provided, for example, like healthcare and other services like fire brigade and such. So you could calculate for example, the government spending on that or not.
Right. No, that's correct. So yes, that's right. And any other ideas?
Maybe life expectancy and education level.
Yes. Good. So maybe we can discuss now at this point. So I agree. So one way to look at it, for example, I don't know if you know United Nations and then United Nations Development Program, every year they issue a report that's called Human Development Report. And it's read mostly or to a large extent because of the indicator that it includes. It's called Human Development Indicator. And it's a composition of GDP, but also of life expectancy and education level. So somebody said how much government spends on education and healthcare. That's right, but those are only inputs, right? And at the end we worry about the outputs. And then it also depends how efficient the government is. So it's not only spending, but how efficiently that money is used. So usually the indicators then include some outputs, and life expectancy is viewed as kind of proximity for health. And then education level, often it's put as average number of years of schooling in the country, but there are other ways to look at it. So that was the original. And then in recent years, there is so much concern, and rightly so, about the environment and the pollution and the climate change. So the United Nations also came with concept of so-called sustainable human development. So there is an environmental component. So we could also then include in the welfare, how environmentally sound the country is in which people live. And there are other measures, for example, security or crime levels. So South Africa in many ways, or if we look at the level of cities, Cape Town is a beautiful city and really interesting to live in for many reasons, but they have a huge inequality and one of the highest rates of crime in the world, and that's pushing the welfare very much down. So you would not find Cape Town, when you start comparing cities, being very high up as far as living, and this is deviation. And of course, if you read CNN this morning, you would read, or yesterday, you would read about the tensions that then now exist between rich and poor in South Africa. So, but going back to the question, so GDP absolutely is always there, but it has been recognized money can buy you everything. And it's not always that the richest countries have the best health and welfare, healthcare systems. We know that the United States doesn't have particularly good one. And same for the education level, and then also how is this GDP produced and how much pollution it generates. So usually there is economic part, GDP, social part, education and health, and environmental part. So that's how we usually assess the welfare in the society at the aggregate level. Okay, and now we go to the applied part that we talked about. So the applied part links the economic theory with the real world. But I should also say here, we should be careful. Econometrics is one way, and statistic, how to relate the theory with the real world. But sometimes econometrics is using past data. So when it comes to coronavirus, we do not run any regressions because we do not have any past data until half a year ago. So sometimes that's why you see suddenly so much probabilistic models when they show you this distribution. That's looking forward and with the data we have. So, but it's not econometrics that's being used right now. Okay, so econometrics is one way, experiments, simulations. This is how we bring theories to the real world. So maybe here, and this is in some sense repetition, how did development of public finance changed over time? So initially, until 1990, as I said, the focus really was on the theory, and at the top universities in the world, the professors focused on pushing the theories and advancing them, and this is what they were also teaching their students. And the issue there was optimal taxation. By optimal taxation, we mean taxation that's highly efficient and effective. Then in the 1990s, we saw many more applied papers, and to kind of bring the theories, the data, and check the reality. And then in the last 10 years or so, we see increasingly use of experiments, and there is development of behavioral public finance. Can someone tell us what you understand by behavioral public finance? It's really quite exciting area of public finance. You can, of course, quickly Google it, right? Behavioral public finance. So just give it, half a minute and think about behavioral public finance, and then we discuss. Okay, so let's make it a little bit more dynamic. So what is behavioral public finance? So the critique of economics, if we look at the traditional models, is that there are assumptions that you will find highly unrealistic. So for example, assumption of infinitely lived consumer, at least at a quick glance, you will find it highly unreasonable, such assumption. So one assumption is people live forever. So this is in dynamic models, and most of modern economics is deal with the economic dynamics. Then the other assumption, people are perfectly rational. So they worry about money, or they worry about certain good, and they want to have as much as possible amount of consumption of that good. And they are perfectly rational in this objective, how to maximize, given their resources, the amount of the good they have. So those are the two key assumptions. So perfect rationality, and also they have perfect information when they make when they make their decisions. So perfect information is processed rationally, and consumers or agents live forever. Now, how was this explained? So there are two ways how economists defend these assumptions. So on one hand, they will tell you, maybe these assumptions are not 100% realistic, but you know what? When we calibrate these models and look at the real data, there comes the empirical check. These models actually perform fairly well. They can kind of predict social security patterns, etc. So it's not so much about assumption, but once I calibrate my model and check it with results, I decide this is okay. So that's one way. It delivers the results. The other way is to say, okay, actually, we're not talking about one person, we aggregate many persons. So if we look at many people over time, then rationality is a reasonable assumption. And infinitely lived, consumer, you can just think, okay, consumers of course do not live forever, but they do live through their children, etc. So if we kind of say, okay, everyone cares about their well-being, but also well-being of their children and grandchildren and so on, then we can have approximately infinitely lived consumer. But anyway, on individual basis, it may be okay at some aggregate basis in some circumstances, but then we know in different situations people do not act perfectly rationally. And this is where the behavioral economics more broadly and behavioral public finance comes in, because they look at it and say, no, people are highly irrational, they have biases, and the biases actually are known and they can be used in public finance. So for example, one bias we have is, when you want to tell people about loss, it's shown that it's actually much better to make it very painful and very quick rather than protracted pain. So we kind of can handle sudden loss better than very gradual and painful loss. But it's the other way with benefits. So, once you will be manager one day, if you will give your staff one huge bonus in 5 years, they will be happy for about a week and then it will be forgotten. So the incentives, it's shown it's better to be given gradually incentives, and people respond better to that. So these are some of the insights of the behavioral public finance. It's, for example, used. Can someone give us example where you think the knowledge of behavior is used? One area of public finance where you think this can be useful? So one area where these insights were heavily used is taxation, actually, tax avoidance. So there is like, by now I would say endless number of experiments across countries and across setting. How can we make people pay taxes, and of course, obviously one way would be threat, and that has been, let's say, in the United States forever, not paying taxes and actually purposely avoiding is a crime and there is a punishment. And that's one way how to incentivize people. But in the experiments, they tried to go about this differently. So, for example, they would send to one group nothing. So the standard letter, you have forgotten to pay your taxes, just a reminder, nothing else. In another letter would be, you have forgotten to pay your taxes, and are you aware that your taxes are funding, needy students or some good cause? And then another one would be, if you pay your taxes on time, there is an added bonus for this, So, and then they were trying to see how do people react. And then also not just that, on what color and is it handwritten? So it was, for example, shown if somebody, like a mayor in a smaller village or etc., would sign the letter personally, it had better impact on tax collection. So these are the insights. I hope now we understand what is behavioral public finance. If we were looking at it only from the traditional economics, the rationally behaving agent, then it really doesn't matter whether mayor signs it or not. There are taxes to be paid. Taxes are money and it's subtracted from the overall funds, and that's where it ends. But once we take the kind of human nature into account, then how the letter is sent and what's in the letter apparently matters as well. And human nature seems to be that positive incentives overall work better than threats and punishment. That, of course, is not in all circumstances, but in many this is true. So here now we just go a little bit into example. How do the various countries, what is the size in the EU of the government? I don't think we still have 2019 data. This is using International Monetary Fund data. By the way, can someone now tell me if you get tasked, find about public expenditures in the EU, what databases would you use? And what database would you use if it were public expenditures all over the world? So where would you start looking? Yes, so can someone share their view? If I would say, okay, go and check, are these data correct? Where would you go?
I mean, you can check out, like, the EU has several sites, but I don't remember exactly the names of them right now.
That's right. So you would check Eurostat. That would be for the EU. And then for the world. And you can also check OECD, by the way. OECD has most of the, but it doesn't have all the EU countries, but the larger EU countries it will have. And then for the whole world, where would you go? You would go to International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. So maybe we can try it in one of the exercises, because it's quite important to be familiar with data sources. And then what would you want to, okay, you could also protest, it's obvious what are public expenditures, and it's obvious what is the GDP. By the way, sorry, this is only one P. But what could you object here that you're not happy actually with this? First of all, source should be there in every graph, but this is presentation. But once we put it into paper or into any document that is not only for own consumption, there needs to be a source. And then what would you want to know here? So these are government expenditures. What would you want to know? What type of governments do we have? So you would want to know, is this only the central government? That's one option. Next one, is it the general government? General government is defined as central government and the local governments together, and of course it would be netted out, but the net expenditures of both of those together. And then third option would be, does this include expenditures of public enterprises? So it's really important then classify what type of level of government or public sector we are speaking about. Now, when we look at the International Monetary Fund website, they use the term general government. So when we're comparing that data, that's what we need to keep in mind, because if we put only central government, it's very limiting. There are countries that carry out a lot of their expenditures through local governments, and we would not catch it. Again, South Africa is one good example, Argentina. So those are countries with strong municipalities and their expenditures. But it's very difficult, and this is why public enterprises are not included, because they are defined differently in different countries and information on them is highly imprecise. So it's almost impossible to collect such information for 190 countries in the world. So again, usually it's just general government, which means central and local governments together. What is this table telling us? And why is there? I mean, why is this is there anything interesting? So what we are trying to do here is look at the size of the government. So we see there's a huge difference between France, which we said is close to central planning, relatively close, obviously not fully close, and let's say between Ireland or some of the other new EU member countries, Latvia, Lithuania. They have much smaller share of government spending in GDP. So this is kind of the message from this graph, that basically size in France is almost double, approximately double of the size of the island. What message would you get out of this table? It doesn't matter whether you look at revenues or expenditures, the message is very similar. And here, general government, central government, general government. It's telling us how do here expenditures, same way plural, vary with income. Okay, so income level of the country. And then at the beginning, somebody said, or earlier on today, somebody said that the level of development in a country depends or can be measured by GDP. And here we measure basically, so here we relate, here we divide the countries by the level of GDP per capita. So that's income level, sometimes referred to as wealth level. So Czech Republic, to which category today Czech Republic falls? Low income, lower middle, upper middle, or high income? Where are we? In which category is the Czech Republic?
Well, I would say somewhere between lower middle income and upper middle income.
Oh, good one. We are in high income. We are advanced economy, really.
All right.
But it depends on classification. You could say it's upper middle to high income. Okay. So that's interesting. You know, I also find it interesting about Czech Republic. Why would you think that we're lower middle income? Because we're neighboring with Germany. And we're neighboring with Austria, and of course they are richer, right? But we're also neighboring with Hungary, significantly poorer than Czech Republic or Poland. Moldova is not too far. So, I mean, I always find this is quite interesting, you know, that perception in the Czech Republic about the well-being that it doesn't actually correspond to reality. I find the living standards in Czech Republic actually quite high and comfortable. And the country has, I mean, this is just now we're deviating, this is personal view, but you know, I lived in quite a few countries. I lived in the United States many years. I lived several years in UK, and I lived almost 2 years in France. And I would really say that, for example, the healthcare system is unquestionably better than in the United States, and it's somewhat better actually than in the UK as well. Now in the UK, and that's true in the US as well, there's a huge difference between private and public system, but my definition of good healthcare system is that basically when people need it and majority of people need it, when average person needs to access it, it's accessible. So it's not accessible only for selected few. So anyway, but according to the IMF, we are advanced economy, Czech Republic, and we are also no longer in emerging markets index, but it's on the border. Some would say we're still like emerging market upper, but certainly not lower middle income. You know, lower middle income would be, for example, Namibia. You know what lower middle income country is globally? Have you heard name Eswatini, Swaziland? So that's your lower middle income country. South Africa is example of your upper middle income country. Botswana is example of upper middle income country. So actually, I think that there is no country in sub-Saharan Africa that is high income.
And
So,
can I ask, what
yeah.
would count as a low income country?
Yeah, low income country example, but you know, I will give you the exact definition of the IMF and then the exact definition of the World Bank, and they may differ. That's why I said Czech Republic may be an upper middle income country in the World Bank, but it's certainly advanced economy in the IMF. Low income, there are so many of them. I mean, have you heard of Central African Republic? Have you heard of Sudan, South Sudan, Southern Sudan? Have you heard of Ethiopia? Those are really poor countries. So that's your low income. And then the threshold will be something like $1,000 in purchasing power parity. Now I'm guessing, this is not precise, but around $1,000 purchasing power parity a year. So $1,000, which is about average monthly one, well, roughly, right? 25,000 crowns is roughly, maybe even more now, 25,000 crowns is roughly average monthly wage in the Czech Republic. In those countries, that would be your average annual wage. Eritrea, very poor country. You know, I drove through some of these countries. There, like housing would be, you know, people put some kind of a towel into the tree and that's a roof, you know, and they hide under that. So sometimes the poverty is just really incredible. So that would be low income. But we should not forget that even within countries like upper middle income country, which is South Africa, for example, there are incredibly poor segments of population. They live in these ghettos, right? And there's quite a bit of coverage of that now related to coronavirus, how those type of population, you know, it's impossible to isolate. I mean, they live, I don't know how many of them live in one room, and they share washing facilities in high number of people, so impossible to isolate. So how, again, the coronavirus will impact quite differently in those societies, the poor people and the richer people. As relatively indiscriminate this virus is still, the level of protection that the poor will have will be very weak. But good question. So just out of interest, I will put the income categories. But point is, Czech Republic is by no means lower middle income country. Anyway, but so, okay, we divide it by level of wealth. And what do we see? That the size of the government and also the ability to collect revenues rises with wealth. So the more advanced economy, the stronger the institutions, and then the better capacity to collect revenues. Now, it's also not desirable to collect always like huge amount of revenues, because that would kind of stifle incentives for economic activity. But in low-income countries, in the very poor ones, or in the resource-rich ones like Nigeria, you know, Nigeria probably is collecting 10% of GDP in their revenue, so very low level. Such government then doesn't have much room to function effectively when the shock hits. And you see the very similar pattern for total expenditures. And I think what's interesting here, that for the middle income countries, it doesn't really matter much whether lower or upper. But then again, okay, here at least for general government, there is difference between high and middle income countries. Here we will look a little bit historically, and from that we can also guess what will probably happen after the coronavirus. So this picture, you know, is showing us, again, what is showing us. You take a look and you see your own things. So I will tell you what I see, and if you see other things or additional things, it would be nice if you share it with me and with your colleagues. So first of all, we see it's really true that less developed countries have smaller share of the government in GDP. So emerging and market economies are below major advanced economies G7, like United States, Australia, Canada, and of course some European countries, but also below the Euro area. But then beyond the advancement of the economy comes the culture and social preference. So in countries where the government has major role in providing for health and education, but also infrastructure and other roles in the economy, which is like in Europe, the share of government is higher than other advanced economies. So here we cannot say it's really the level of development that's driving the difference, but cultural and societal preferences. So that's one thing we see, right? So, and that's true across time. Second thing I would hope you see in this graph that there is quite a bit of jump in after 2009. So what do you think was this? What was the cause of the jump here?
The financial crisis.
Exactly. So the global financial crisis, which was accompanied by basically recession and deep fall in GDP, again, huge differences across countries. In Czech Republic, it was not such deep decline, but let's say small countries, Iceland, Lithuania, Estonia, there was a huge fall in GDP there, okay? And in response to that fall of GDP, the countries implemented fiscal stimulus measures. And the fiscal stimulus measures would consist of cut in taxes and increase in expenditures. And actually, interestingly, the tax component was very important. Like in Czech Republic, for example, at the time, there was more emphasis on reducing the taxes than expenditures, but both played a role. But then it was not really scaled back. So the crisis has passed and there was no correction to come. So what we saw in many countries, that actually debt has piled up. That here we have expenditures, but if we look at public debt, especially in the advanced economies, the level of debt has increased. So that's second thing. And then maybe third thing, which is more nuanced, but let me show you. You can see that the increase was higher. We would probably want different scale, then it would be more obvious. But anyway, hopefully we can see it here. The increase was higher in advanced economies, but it was not slightly lower in the emerging markets and developing countries, but then it continued. You can see here it starts, okay, a little bit declining in the advanced economies, but still in the Euro area way above. But here, it continues actually to rise in 2015, 2016. Why do you think there would be this different pattern between advanced economies and developing countries? So, you know, it was global financial crisis. So the less developed countries, like let's give example of Africa, where the countries on average are the poorest, you know, they are not very integrated into global financial markets. So there are a few exceptions like South Africa, Morocco, Egypt. Those are deeply integrated, but most other countries are not really accessing. And this has, by the way, changed in the last 5 years. But we're talking 2009, 2010. At that time, you know, most countries did not have credit rating. They were not issuing Euro bonds. They were not really closely linked to global financial markets. So that crisis would hit them indirectly through collapsing trade or through their trading partner. Like for many African countries, it would actually be transferred through South Africa. But here, what happened in 2015, 2016, it was a commodity price shock. So we saw fall in commodity prices, and that of course is something that really drives the well-being of developing countries. So that was more, in some sense, heavier for them than the global financial crisis. Now the coronavirus will be different because the healthcare systems in developing countries are much weaker. So there is quite a heavy risk that this will impact them heavily. But anyway, time will tell, and we will see and learn from it. Here is just a point that usually when we think of government revenues, we think about foreign aid, we think about taxes. But for developing countries, there is another and quite important source of government revenue, and it's in particular foreign aid. So in some countries, and especially in post-conflict countries like Sierra Leone, Liberia, I mean, the conflict has been many years ago, but still, or DRC or Cote d'Ivoire. So those countries were heavily in the conflict. When the conflict ends, they do benefit from substantial foreign inflows, foreign aid inflows. So it can account until 6-7% of GDP. Now, here we have the graph until early 2000. So as we saw on the earlier graph, the debt and the public expenditures increased after the global financial crisis. So with that also capacity of advanced economies to provide foreign aid. So if we would extend this graph, it probably would not be so high anymore. It would be a bit lower. Not probably, for sure. Now this is quite important. So we want to understand what are some of the functions of public finance. So there are three key functions of public finance. One is allocative function, and it operates on the microeconomic level. Again, one of your colleagues here was speaking about micro and macroeconomics. So here we go. So allocative function concerned with efficiency operates on micro level. So we all should be assigned to our best productive use. We all should be consuming goods that, maximize our utility, etc. Then there is the macroeconomic stabilization function. And I have put an essay question for you. By the way, it's voluntary, it's not mandatory, but it gives you some idea how the exam could look. Now, if essay would appear on exam, it would not be 2-page, it would be half-page, maximum 1-page essay. But here it's just to think about current issues as well. So stabilizing function deals with the macroeconomics and the business cycle. And finally, there is non-economic function that deals with redistribution. And it takes criteria like justice. Now, so for economists, it's much easier to deal with allocative function of public finance and stabilization function of public finance. Justice begins to be a little bit more complex because on some level, people have agreement what is fair and what is not. But on some other level, it's very difficult to agree on what is fair. I mean, once we go into details. So that would be that. And then maybe we end on Pareto optimality. So have you heard it in some of your, this is talking a little bit more about the allocative function, which is concerned with efficiency. So have you heard about Pareto optimality? So let's talk about Pareto optimality, give an example, and then let's have discussion or question, and we will take a break. Because as I said, these online things are actually a little bit more intense than when we have normal interaction. So public finance is concerned with efficient and fair, whatever fair is, allocation of resources. So now if we define Pareto optimality, it's an allocation, so it's assignment of good or property to every member of society, and it's such allocation that no one can gain without someone else losing. So assumption here is that more is better, that if we have, I don't know how many people are online, let's say 20, if we have 20 oranges, then everybody would want to have as many oranges, which in this case would mean 20, all of them as possible. So suppose we allocate the oranges in such a way that everyone in the class gets one orange. Is it Pareto optimal? Or can we reallocate? Can we take away one orange from me and give it to someone else? Is it possible under definition of Pareto optimality? No, because it would not be Pareto improvement, because I would be worse off. I would be missing my orange. Someone else would be better off having 2 oranges, but one person would be worse off. So situation where everyone has 1 orange out of 20 and it's 20 of us, that's Pareto optimal. Now suppose I think I saw Mano Jan here, so suppose Jan has, anyway, suppose person X has all the oranges, 20 oranges. Is it Pareto optimal? Can someone share their thoughts? Okay, so let's make it concrete. Suppose I have all the 20 oranges. It's 20 of us on this phone call, roughly. I have all the oranges or whatever, and I have all the oranges. Is it Pareto optimal?
No.
Why not?
Because the rest of the people are losing.
Yeah, I agree with you, but you know, this is actually, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Carry on.
So that you have all the oranges and the rest is just losing.
Yeah. So I agree with you. Actually, intuitively, we all cringe. And, you know, frankly, I myself am not comfortable having all the oranges and seeing everyone else having nothing. But this is where the behavioral economics comes on. I mean, but the traditional economics, when we talk just about efficiency, okay, there are 20 oranges in the room, right? We said every person is happy to take all 20 of them because they think, okay, I can make orange juice or you know, I can make compote, I can preserve the orange, I can make marmalade and I can eat the oranges today. So, you know, I don't want to give any orange away. I have no particular friendship with anyone else in the class. I take my 20 oranges and walk away. So it is Pareto optimal. But what you're talking about, and I agree with you, it's not fair. So then the notion of fairness comes and says, why should one person have all the oranges and we all need vitamin C, especially now with the immunity? How can this be one person's walking away with all of them? So Pareto efficiency is very narrow concept. It is useful, but only in very narrow circumstances. So Pareto efficiency is basically telling us nothing is wasted. So situation is, what's your name? You answered, what is your name?
Ornella.
Right. So suppose we have situation where Ornella has 19 oranges and there is one orange sitting, you know, somewhere. Suppose we are in one room and on the table there is just one orange sitting idle. Is this Pareto optimal?
No, I think.
Right, it's not. And why it's not?
Because Ornella can still gain one more orange.
Right. So we can take the one orange and still give it to Ornella. She will have 20. We will say, oh gee, we still have nothing. But in any case, Ornella will be better off because she can make more marmalade at home and that makes her happy. But we can give to you also. What's your name?
Elon.
Ilan?
Yeah.
Right, so we can give the 1 orange to Ilan. Also, that allocation is Pareto optimal. Okay, Ornella has 19. Ilan, unfortunately, has only 1, and the rest of us has nothing. But we cannot take that 1 orange from Ilan. He would be worse off, and we cannot take even 1 orange from Ornella because she really wants to produce her marmalade and will be better off. So that's the point of view of Pareto efficiency. It's basically telling us nothing should be wasted ever. But it's not telling us about fairness. It's also not telling us who should get the 1 orange. You know, there's 1 orange idle. Should Ilan get it? Should someone else in the class get it? Maybe they have a little bit of a cold and they need the vitamin C more. So Pareto efficiency is completely useless when it comes to fairness. Okay, and remember, we are always concerned about efficiency and fairness together. And when we listen to our politicians, they are actually mostly concerned about redistribution and not necessarily fairness, but at least kind of satisfying the key societal segments that will vote for them in the next election. That's a cynical point of view. Now, benevolent central planner, and I really believe that to some extent during this coronavirus we do see a lot of goodwill and benevolence. So then the benevolent official would care about everyone in the society and the overall well-being. So I think please try to think a little bit now. Let's take a pause, but think a little bit more about the Pareto optimality. And let's make sure we understand. It's basically if no resource is wasted, if everything is utilized, all the 20 oranges, you can put any other good, any other service. You can also think of factors of production. If everything is utilized, we are operating efficiently and optimally from Pareto point of view. But it's not telling us anything about fairness. So now we take a break and then, think about questions and maybe please take time to look at the essay also I put up. So that's what you should do. And then at 11, we will continue with the second part.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
So the homework in NCS is the essay.
Yeah.
Which is voluntary. So
yeah, it's not mandatory, but I recommend you, I'm putting up these things and I will also put some examples of multiple choice and different type of questions because I want, my exams are not mystery. You will not come the last day and see exam and say, wow, how did this ever happen? So if you go through, you can expect something similar. As I said, shorter, not 2 pages, but something similar on the exam. But,
where can we find this document, please?
It's on INSYS. It's called Exercise 1.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we have only one final test, yeah? When it's gonna be?
Yes, one final test. I forgot. Did I send you email about presentations? I don't think so. So this is way too large class to do presentations. So yeah, there will be only final test. But maybe we will have practice test. So so we see how the test may look.
Yeah, we had only one email that we will have an exam like home task, so it's not
right. Oh, I should say about that. So I was told I need to be careful. So it will be home test if this quarantine continues, right? But if it's not continuing, we will have in-class test. But in either way, you should look at the questions I'm posting because that's a good indication what the exam will be.
It's in the end of May still.
Pardon me?
When the test will be in the?
Oh, I need to think of it. Yeah, I need to put some dates for the exam.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So we're back at 11. Yep.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Can I have a question? The exam will be from topics that you teach or also from the topics that was taught by the other professor?
Right. So, I've taught this course last semester with a different instructor, but I assume this will be the same. So I will put my part of the exam and he will put his part and probably we will, and then we will add those parts together. And at least, but let me check this. It's in the last semester, it was 50-50. So you get like half of the grade proportionally from my part and half of the grade from their part. Is it clear?
Yes, that is clear. Will his part also not be a surprise or will that be a surprise?
Oh, that, I have no idea. That you need to discuss with him. I'm just kind of transferring how I studied. I studied at University of Minnesota, and there are sometimes like I learned with experience that in fact I do want to give everyone opportunity to really prepare for what's coming. So this is about what we learn. It's really not random test of knowledge or anything else. So yeah, but you need to discuss with him his exam. I really have no idea.
All right, and
I'm sure it will be fine. He's a very experienced and kind person too. So yeah.
yes, and with the mandatory reading, do we have to read every single mandatory reading that is given to us? I know it says mandatory, but what does that mean?
I think I put usually at the end, right, the chapter. Let's look if I did it here. Yeah, so you should read. It's actually not so long. So look, if you go here, you should read chapter 1 of Gruber.
And where can we find this book?
Yeah, so this is a bit of a problem. So I will try to see if I can put a chapter PDF copy on, but it should be online now or okay. Let me acquire. Obviously, I have the book on my shelf, and normally you would have it in library. But so let me look into this. But again, you should read it because also you want to learn. But again, on the exam, it will be more my questions.
So we can expect more questions from the presentations than from the books. Can we expect any questions from the books?
We will discuss. So as you noticed, I discuss other things that are just on the presentation, right? So as we go through class, we may be discussing parts from the book, right? So it's not only the presentation. Yeah. So you should read the chapter.
All right. So if you could just help us acquire the book, or
I totally agree. Yeah. So let me look into that.
yes, thank you very much.
Okay. And it's not about acquiring the book. We don't read the whole book, but the relevant parts. Yeah.
Yes.
So excuse me.
Yes.
So you means like besides that, I see you give us on the insist. You will also give us like some other exercise or.
Right. That's what I said. And I will put, for example, the multiple choice. I will put type of questions again on the internet. And sometimes I was surprised that even though all the questions were put up, that people didn't always answer them. But anyway, so if you look at them, and I encourage you, I will start putting them like as we cover them, so gradually during the course. And if anything is not clear, then bring it up and we'll go through it in the class. So let's say after today's class, let me put few questions on what we covered on the INSYS.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let's take a break now and we resume again at 11 o'clock. So speak to you soon. Bye. Any more questions? Yeah?
No, thanks.
Okay, bye. Takže budeme pokračovat v kurzu. Jednu minutu.
Miss, I think you need to speak English, not Czech, just saying.
Okay. Sorry. So we will carry on with the course, and we started with Pareto optimality. So here we just review the basic functions of public finance. So again, we have allocative function, distribution function, and stabilizing function. Can somebody tell us what part of economics or what approach or what role these functions play? So in the first one, we talk about efficiency. Does the allocative function deal with macro or micro? Do you recall from 1 hour ago?
Micro.
Yeah, that's right. So that's on the micro level. Now the distribution function, it deals with justice, and therefore it's really non-economic function. And then we have the stabilizing function, which is macroeconomics. Obviously today what we observe in the economy is a lot of focus on the stabilizing function of public finance. When we take United States as example, about 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago, Central Bank or the Federal Reserve Bank took action and it significantly reduced the policy rate. So that was stabilizing function being played by the monetary policy. And now recently, last week, actually early this week, the Congress adopted. So anyway, in the United States, the stimulus package was approved. It's the largest stimulus package in the history of the country. Of course, we look at it in nominal terms, nevertheless, by far the largest, $2 trillion. And some people are saying that even that may not be enough to really bring the output to the potential level. So that's the macro function. By the way, the essay, again, I wrote it for you in the comment because some of you were saying you cannot find it in INSYS. So please look at public finance-exercise 1 and you will find it among the materials put on INSYS. Right, so here let's review the Pareto optimality. So we were talking about kind of Pareto criterion. So the point here is which point should government prefer, E or E1? Is there any way? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Rather E than E1.
Why?
Because it's closer to the middle.
Right,
Like
so you, yeah, okay, go ahead.
Is it because
Nothing to
E1
say,
doesn't? Oh, sorry.
Just go on, sorry.
E because E1 doesn't lie on the frontier.
Okay, so this is the point. Any other views?
Maybe I think for E, it's the utility for both through
Right. So this is just review of the example had. So we had 20 oranges for 20 people. So now imagine we have 20 oranges, but only 2 groups. So 20 people divide into 2 groups. Suppose each group has 10 people. It doesn't really matter. So here it's a situation where approximately each group would have 10 oranges, or maybe one group would have 9 and one group would have 8. Here it's a situation where one group would have 19 oranges and the other one only 1. So this is much more unequal. But remember what we were trying to say. From Pareto optimality, we cannot really say which one is better. They both are utilizing all the oranges. How can we tell? Because they are at the border here of the utility function. So we cannot improve group B by simply saying, okay, group A has too many oranges and we have only 1. We cannot then take away from group A and move. We cannot move from E1 to E and say this is Pareto optimal. So Pareto criterion gives us no guidance whether E should be preferred or E1. It's only telling us all the oranges or whatever other resource we are thinking about are utilized. Because intuitively, without context, you may say, okay, it seems really much better if resources are divided equally. But suppose group B is extremely wealthy population, and suppose group A is, the socially excluded group of population living below the poverty line, struggling really and barely surviving. So who should then get the resources, let's say, from the government? Most people would say in those circumstances, it's group A. So going back to the example of the stimulus in the United States, one part of the package is distributing just lump sum amount of $1,200 to any family that had in 2019 gross annual income below $75,000. So we're not talking about individual. Of course, there are a lot of families that consist of one income earner, but for many family, for many people, it would be more than one person in the family. So we're talking about family income. Still, it's way above the average of the average household income in the United States, 75,000, and they will still get the lump sum. But above 75,000, it starts to be nuanced, and I think above gross annual income for the family, $150,000, they will not get any support. So it's not equally distributed, but it makes sense that it should be the part of society that need the stimulus the most. Talking a little bit more about stimulus policies, the point is not only to increase consumption, but really to have multiplier effect on the economy. So if $1,200 is distributed to particularly wealthy segments of population, most likely they will not spend it. They will just park it in their savings account or some money market account and not even notice this has arrived because it will be such a small fraction of their annual income. But for the poor families, it makes much more difference. So here I'm just saying this seems unequal, but without knowing who the group A is and how much they do need these extra resources, we cannot really make any judgment. Where we can make judgment though is point F, right? So at point F, the utility of group A is here, and then utility of group B is here. So would moving to point E be Pareto improving? So first of all, it's suboptimal. This is not Pareto optimal allocation, right? Because we can make either group B or group A better off without making the other one worse off. And in fact, we can make both better off. So let's try to think about that. Would point E be Pareto improvement to point F? And again, you want to ask yourself, is either group A or group B worse off, and is any of them better off? And based on that, you can decide whether point E is Pareto improvement. So think about it, and can someone share with us their thoughts? So there are two things we're looking here. First question was, is any of these points Pareto optimal? So if that's the simple question, are these points E, E1, and F Pareto optimal? We can say E is Pareto optimal, E1 is also Pareto optimal, but F is not, because we can improve one of the groups or both. Now, and then the second level we ask, is this Pareto improving, which means are both groups at least as well off, and then, one of the groups better off. So is point E going from F to E Pareto improvement?
So E is Pareto improvement and E1 is not.
Exactly, and can you elaborate why you reached that conclusion?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Because as you said, on the point E, both A and B are better off, and on E1 only the group A is better off, not the group
exactly.
B.
So perfect. So when we want to determine the set of Pareto improving allocations, and I have included PPT on the online, which goes in great detail into this and competitive equilibrium. And if there is time, we go through, but for now, we just are content with this. So you can draw a line, right? And you can say, if I draw a line through point F here, then I know that consumption of group A cannot fall below this. But anywhere above to the right from this line is fine as far as Pareto improving allocation. Then I do the same for group B. So in this case, I draw horizontal lines through point F. Anywhere above is Pareto improvement. And then of course, these are two sets and we take intersection of these two sets and we get a triangle. So anywhere above and in this triangle is Pareto improvement relative to point F. So even here, if we take straight line from point F to E, anywhere along the line is an improvement relative to the point F. But along the line is still Pareto suboptimal until we reach point E. So very good. So then we understand. So, but we cannot say we should move from point E to E1 or E1 to E. That is not possible. But we can say moving to point E is improvement. So I think now we understand. So now we can talk a little bit more formally about what we understand and what's important from assessing welfare. We have the first welfare theorem, and again we go back, we define the welfare a little bit at the beginning. So here, this is quite important. Under the assumption of perfect competition, and then some of the assumptions are no externalities, no perfect information, and no price and there is a full price flexibility. That means there are zero transaction costs and there are also no barriers to entry. Actually, one condition that's really critical for perfect competition is large number of participants and ideally infinite number of participants. By participants, we mean both sellers and buyers, and there is infinite number of them. So each of them is so small, they cannot impact the price. So both producers and consumers are price takers. And also they produce and consume homogeneous products. So that means, consumers do not have any preferences from which producer to buy. It's all exactly the same product. So under assumptions of perfect competition, and in particular then specifically the assumptions I mentioned, then equilibrium is Pareto efficient. The second welfare theorem is less relevant for us. It's just telling us that Pareto optimal allocation can be reached with endowments and with transfers. But for us, I highlighted in yellow what matters. So if conditions of perfect competition are satisfied, that market equilibrium is Pareto optimum, then from point of view of efficiency, allocative efficiency, there is really no need for government intervention. So government intervention from the point of view of efficiency, and remember we have other criteria, we have also fairness, but now we talk about efficiency. Intervention is justified only in case of market failure. So we have, for example, market failure when there are externalities because action of one individual or one firm impacts either positively or negatively the others. So it's externalities. Can someone explain to us, first of all, give us example of externalities and maybe a little bit more formally explain to us what is meant and why this represents market failure? Okay, so to stay current, can we take the current coronavirus and use it as an example of externality? Can somebody go ahead?
Sure, it's a negative externality.
Yeah, exactly. And can you elaborate a little bit in what sense it's negative? And externalities, they can have either benefit or cost that are not taken into account. So how does this one work? So there are consumer externalities, producers externalities, negative and positive. So you said it's a negative externality, mostly on the side of the consumers or individuals.
Yes, most on the side of the consumers, but I would add that also the producers are harmed by the coronavirus situation within the market growth, rising unemployment, and the fact that half of the businesses cannot function due to the shutdown. So this is a great example of negative externalities and how the market adapts towards the negative externalities.
But maybe so we can, the primary kind of channel of the externality is basically negative externality among individuals, and it doesn't matter really whether the individuals meet at the point of their work or whether the individuals meet when shopping in a supermarket, but basically seemingly healthy individual can pass on the virus. So the individual goes around shopping thinking, or they go happily to work thinking they are healthy and there is no problem, when in fact they are infecting others. So that's example of negative externality on an individual level transferred from person to person. So we can say that they actually do not take into account the social cost of their actions. So they think of their private cost, going out and shopping, but they do not think about the negative impact then they have on others. But that's right. So that's an example of negative externality. And that's why government intervention is justified. So the government tries to intervene, and there are different tools. Some are more crude and some are others. Usually principle of good government intervention that is well targeted. So, but in this case, there is so little known that, it makes sense that the targeting is rather crude and the measures apply to everyone, because we don't have perfect information who actually is infected and who is not. But basically too much moving around, so the government puts in measures to restrict the movement and slow the spread. So that's one example. And then more traditional one, in terms of production, is too much production where the farm pollutes the environment. So you could also think again about the corona, that by producing, the virus is spread more often. Of course, it depends on service or production. You can think about the tourism sector, right? Too much. I think in the future, we will be thinking more, if we ever were interested in that, but perhaps not. But if we were interested in that, we would be thinking more whether it makes sense to go on a cruise holiday, right? Because a lot of that virus seems to be spreading on ships. So again, that's example of production and negative externality in the process of the production. But anyway, if there are no externalities, that's one condition. Perfect information is important. So in the past, for example, small agricultural producer would not have information about the prices somewhere in Africa. So collecting information about price and whether it makes sense to consume the produce domestically or be taking it to the market was limited. So sometimes they had to spend the whole day going, etc. Today they have a mobile technology, the prices arrive in the morning, so there is perfect information about the prices and what to do. And then again, the transaction cost. So that's again where the mobile technology is extremely helpful. So it overcomes distance, as we see now here today, but also for the agricultural producers, again, the transaction costs are much, much lower. And then let's not forget the important assumption of many producers and many consumers in the market. When we don't have this situation, sometimes we think of thin market, so we either talk about markets are incomplete or markets are thin. And what usually people refer to when they speak in these terms, they talk about situation where there are very few participants in the market. Example could be like foreign exchange markets in developing countries. There are so few participants that the exchange rate at the end, we cannot really say that reflects supply and demand. So in those situations, there may be some justification for government intervention. So just to summarize, economists do not like the idea of just government intervening in our life on a whim and without any reason and without any structure. So public intervention is justified by market failure. When these conditions are not met, equilibrium is not Pareto optimal. Then, of course, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, there is the fairness reason for intervention and income or wealth inequality. But right now we still speak about the allocative function of public finance. So this is just review. Market power, imperfect competition, public goods, common resources, externalities, imperfect information. Now, internalities, the government knows the best. That's one reason for the government intervention, but of course opponents have exactly the other view, and we have one lecture, a lesson or day dedicated to government failure. So government has also limitations on its capacity. Can someone think about why we can be skeptical about government effectiveness? So there are market failures, there are also government failures. Can someone try to tell us what you see as possible government failures? And again, you can try to think about the current situation, when there are these questions, always try to think of example from real life. Where did you see the government fail? It maybe have occurred to you during your life, oh, this is really not done very well. So can you think of examples?
Excuse me, government failures concerning exactly what?
Well, government has its function, right? And we see it functioning in the economy and in our society. Did it ever occur to you that maybe government is not functioning efficiently? So proponents of government intervention say, okay, there is a need for government to act because markets have failed and government needs to take corrective measure. Now, opponents to that will say, yes, but government has its own limitation and it fails sometimes. What would be the reasons why government is failing in its interventions?
Maybe because some people in the government can act in their own interest instead of acting in the interest of the government and of the state.
Exactly. So, at the end, government officials are also just people. So that's one reason. And they have their own utility functions or their own interests. And usually they try to maximize them. So usually it's wealth and prestige that they think about. So they will try to use their time in the government to promote those interests. And often we sum it by that, they care about re-election, because if they are re-elected, they will have access to resources, and presumably in most governments, the jobs are also associated with some prestige or influence, etc. And then in practice, what we often see is then it shows in time horizon. So very difficult for elected government to think in really long term. Like that's why climate change is such a difficult issue to tackle, because people can take measures today, but they will take effect in 10, 15 years, some of them. And that's way beyond election horizon of most governments. So the governments focus on visible, tangible projects that will lead results within 4 years, so they can demonstrate to their constituencies, that there are results. So that's one reason. The other one is simply capacity constraints. And we see it on the current health crisis. So even public hospitals, as well-meaning and well-intentioned that they may be, they are facing limits. So there may be, and then for government, there simply may be analytical capacity or not enough high-quality information. Today, we often speak about evidence-based policy making. So often the governments do not have the evidence or the evidence on timely basis to act in a timely manner. Going back, to the stimulus. And then the other one is that kind of the incentives, it's much easier for the governments to spend and disperse resources rather than tighten the budget. So we often talk over the medium term, and that's why we see accumulation of debt. We often talk about asymmetric fiscal policy. So what do we mean by that is that during recession or during crisis, the governments are willing to enact extra measures and to spend. But then during the good times, they are not really willing to increase the taxes or reverse the measures and bring the debt on more sustainable path. So we see gradual increase or sometimes abrupt increase in the debt rather than, but of course there are countries that succeeded in reducing their debt. Actually, Hungary is quite a good example. After the global financial crisis, it worked really on its public debt from quite high level. So these are some of the reasons for government failures: poor incentives, political cycles, but also simply limited capacity. So sometimes government does not know the best. Often what we see in practice and has developed in recent years is something called public-private partnerships. So sometimes there are market failures, sometimes there are government failures, but if we put the best capabilities of government and private sector together, perhaps those are the good results. So we can talk about that also. So now let's move to the distributive function of public finance. So market outcomes are often unequal, and then the question is, on what basis how do we define equality? So there can be equality of outcomes or equality of opportunities. In most societies, there is preference for equal opportunities because guaranteed equal outcomes often take incentives of putting any effort into production, etc. So we should also realize that redistribution policies often entail efficiency costs. So often, but not always, often we see trade-offs. So if the policy prefers equality, it takes away some incentives from efficiency. And now we can talk a little bit about the stabilizing function of public finance. So here again, it's the macroeconomic function, and the goal is to mitigate and kind of reduce the volatility of business cycle. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So again, fiscal policies where government spends money to provide goods and services, pays for these expenditures through taxation and borrowing. But important here is the objective, because you could also say this is at the end budgetary policy, but the difference in fiscal policy has a clear objective. And the clear objective is to bring output close to this potential. Can someone define or try to think, let's not define, but when you hear, and again, if you would read and I'm sure you do, when you read the European Commission documents about Czech economy, for example, you will often find the term potential output and output gap. Can somebody explain to us what they think when they read these terms? What is potential output and what is output gap?
Isn't it the difference between the actual and potential GDP?
Right, perfect. So what you just mentioned is output gap, and you are right. So when the actual GDP is above potential, then we talk about positive output gap. And the other way, when the actual GDP is below the potential, then we talk about negative output gap. Sometimes it's also applied to real GDP growth, so potential growth and the actual growth, exactly same idea. When it's above, then there is positive growth gap, and when there is below, it's negative growth gap. So the only thing that remains now is for us to understand what is potential output. Not necessarily how it's empirically derived, there are different methods, but conceptually, what do you understand? And you answered this, but still, I'm sure you think, okay, what is potential output?
Like the highest level of GDP.
So this would be tempting to think so, right? But actually it's not. And if it were really the highest level, we would not be above it, right? So if actual output would be above the highest level, how would that work, right? So if the actual output would be above the highest level, it would become the highest level and potential. So no, potential output, but it makes sense, right? Kind of, when we think about it in personal terms, when we say I want to reach my potential, we are always talking about our maximum. But when it comes to GDP, it's actually output that's produced when the inputs and all capacities are optimally utilized. So they are utilized fully, but they are not strained. So when we go, let's say, back 1 year, or maybe even half a year, but 1 year for sure, into the Czech economy, the unemployment was about 2%, right, of the labor force. That's probably lowest in the Czech history. It was also the lowest in the EU. But that was, output was that we experienced overheating, and output was above potential because the capacities of people and of the labor force was strained. So people were working overtime, firms could not find workers. So potential output is where unemployment is at its natural rate. Natural rate means there is no cyclical and there is also no structural, but there is still frictional unemployment as people are moving from one job to another. So if we define potential output like that, then there is possibility that the actual output can be above potential, but it happens at the cost of overutilizing and overstraining the capacities, either the labor force or the capital. If it's below, then the productive factors are not optimally utilized, so we have either unemployment or we have underutilized resources. And also this is why, according to the Keynesian economics, it's important to recognize, so just taking a step back, under neoclassical economics, there was no such thing as involuntary unemployment. The traditional neoclassical economics and perfectly competitive markets would say when people are not working, they're taking leisure. So it's voluntarily decision that they are not working at a given price and they prefer leisure. It reflects their preferences. But Keynesian theory really appeared after the Great Depression in the late 1920s, 1930s in the United States and globally. And Keynes recognized that actually there is no such, there is such a thing as involuntary unemployment. It's also true that markets may correct the inefficiency at some point, the invisible hand, but it took awfully long. And the lesson of Keynesian economics was that this can be made much faster through government interventions. So what are some of the goals of fiscal policy? So we have some of the national goals include growth, and that's really a key one. Stability, we mean the fluctuation of real GDP. Full employment means the flip side is potential output, and unemployment is at its natural rate. So when we talk about full employment, it does not mean everyone's working. There is still unemployment, but there is no cyclical unemployment. Security, that's one of the basically traditional functions of public finance, which, we mentioned the core ones today, but of course the traditional functions of public finance was also to provide national security, still is, and to establish the rule of law. It's very interesting, again, this is quite fine conceptually, but then when we look at actual budgets of countries, the share of expenditures that goes to national defense really varies very widely. And one example was when Eritrea was in border war with Ethiopia in early 2000s. It really has ramped up tremendously its spending, its defense spending, but at the end it didn't really help. It's a very small country, so I think we cannot say it has reached its objectives. And here we go back to equity and efficiency that we discussed before. So just redefining the externalities again. So externalities are benefits or costs from a transaction extended beyond the buyer or seller. So normally the benefits and costs would be between the two agents that interact in the market, but in case of externality, it's beyond. And here just positive externality example, technology spillover, you can think of ICT. And usually, like when people innovate, it's something. Knowledge is a really very good example of positive externality. We can keep our knowledge ourselves, but we can also share it, and other people transform it in a way that suits them and their needs. And that's how there are additional positive externality from having knowledge. We don't lose anything, but others presumably benefit. Negative externality, we talked about the pollution, for example, so that's a classic one. Let's try a little bit define public goods. So to definition, or when we want to decide whether good is private or public, we ask, is there a rivalry in consumption? Does it mean that if I consume or if Ornella consumes the good, then no one else is able to consume it? That means, yes, there is a rivalry in consumption. And the other one, is it excludable, or is it excluded? So is it possible to exclude other from consumption? So if answer is yes to both, then it's a private good. And if answer is no to both, then it's public good. And if answer is yes and no, then it's mixed good. So we can now try some maybe examples of public good. So for example, national defense, that's almost classical example of public good, because there is no rivalry, right? We are all, as we're sitting here today, we are all equally protected by the defense. I mean, I presume most of us sit, perhaps not everyone, but most of us sit on the territory of the Czech Republic. So we are all equally protected by the national defense of the Czech Republic, perhaps also NATO, as it applies. And we cannot exclude anyone. We cannot say, oh, I really don't like my neighbor, so I would like to exclude them from protection from national defense. It is not possible, no excludability. Then, of course, example of private good is rivalry in consumption. Excludability is the apple. I mean, or orange. If Ornella consumes the orange, then no one else can exclude it. Now let's try some other examples. So how about, for example, ambulance, or we can even think of national health system. For example, in UK, NHS is publicly funded. Is it public good, or is it mixed good? But think also about calling fire service. There is a fire in your apartment building. Is it public good, a fire service, or is it mixed good, or is it private good? And then think about calling ambulance, for example. So ambulance services, is it public good, private, mixed?
Public.
So let's give it 1 minute and try to think about examples for each category. Okay, so let's go through some of the examples. So let's start with ambulance service. You know, is it public good? Is it private good, or is it a mixed good?
Public.
You could say in normal cases, yes, but I would say it's actually a mixed one. So calling ambulance, can we exclude anyone from calling ambulance? We have the number, we all have the number, right? So all of us can call it. It's actually same in the European Union. So I agree with you there that everyone who is on this call, in fact, everyone in Prague now, plus everyone who is on this call from wherever can call ambulance. But let's think only about Prague. So everyone in Prague, every household in Prague has a right to call ambulance. But what will happen when they do?
Maybe some of them can't afford the or
yeah, so if all of us will call, all whatever 1 million households will call the ambulance right now, some of us will wait very long time. So we cannot exclude from calling, but there is a rivalry in consumption. Who calls first will get the service. Who calls as number 5,000 or 500,000, they will have a hard time reaching response. So there is a rivalry in consumption. So I would put it here, it's a common resource, and if we overstrain it, we will not be getting the benefits. This is true for any common resource. Again, the coronavirus in other countries shows the examples with overstrained hospitals and public health system. Everybody has theoretically right, but in practice, not everyone. Everyone has right to ask for it, but not everyone will receive it, only up to a point. Then, but in normal times, if the system is not overstrained, you could say, yes, that's a public good. The other public good, for example, would be street lamp, you know, on the street. That, yes, I mean, everyone benefits from the light as long as the bulb is fine, and no one can be excluded. So for that particular street, that is an example of public good. Now, how about empty road with toll fee? So one has to pay to access the road, but the road is empty. Where would you put it? Is it private good, is it public good, or is it mixed good? Is it excludable? So to enter the road, you have to pay toll fee. What is it telling you about excludability?
It's not excludable.
It is, because unless you pay the fee, you will not get on the road. So the fee is excluding you from the consumption. It must exist also here in the Czech Republic. I mean, in some parts where I'm used to driving, to access certain fast roads, you have to pay the toll fee. Or I lived in Côte d'Ivoire, in Abidjan, they built new bridge, but to access the bridge, one had to pay the fee. But it really improved the speed of the transport. So that's example of excludability. If you pay, you can access the road, if you do, or bridge. If you do not pay, you do not access. So you're excluded by non-paying. As long as it's empty, then there is no rivalry in consumption. So it's a mixed good. Now, how about empty road with no toll fee? So I think this is what you were getting at. There is no excludability. If there is no fee, no barrier, anyone can access the road. And if the road is fairly empty, we all consume the road quite comfortably. So there is no rivalry in consumption. So empty road with no toll fee, no barrier to access is a public good. Are you with me?
Yes.
Okay. So at home, try to think, or as you walk the streets of Prague, well, we don't walk now, but anyway, try to, as you browse internet or whatever, try to think of some other examples that would be falling into, I mean, private goods are fairly obvious, but public goods or mixed goods, where the borderline is. So it's about the mixed goods. Are they really private, or are they really public, or are they mixed? And sometimes they may be public, sometimes they may be mixed. So crowded road with no toll fee is also not public good, because if it's really crowded, we cannot get on it. So we're excluded from consuming that road in transport. Also in your answers when we do tests, but in general in life, it's really quite important to communicate clearly and specify the assumptions. So it has really happened sometimes on tests that I have some question in mind, but if the person puts clearly the assumptions they have in mind, and it's clear therefore why they are arguing the results they are arguing, it can be that actually with those assumptions I agree. So sometimes there are no right or wrong answers, there are only well explained answers and well argued answers, and that's really more important than memorize. So do not try to memorize, try to understand the principles and then explain how you derive the result with the principles. So here the guiding criteria are excludability and rivality. Okay, so here we move to some simple, actually just kind of overview. What do we mean by government receipts? And what do we mean by government spending? So here the focus is really mostly on taxes. By the way, we should rather say social insurance fees, because they are not your classical taxes. But by other, what we are trying to say that many governments all over the world have other sources of revenues than only taxes. So for resource-rich countries, the resources they have are usually fees from allowing firms to operate or benefit from the natural resource. And I think we already mentioned that for developing low-income countries, they also have a benefit of foreign aid. We also said in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, the capacity of advanced economies to provide foreign aid has been diminished. And we can expect it will be further constrained after the coronavirus. So that's why also it's really heavily emphasized that countries should not get dependent on aid. And by the way, new EU members, by new, of course, we're talking now countries that, new in apostrophes, countries that acceded in 2004, including Czech Republic. For many years, they have benefited from structural funds. And there were also arguments that, yes, growth has been high in these countries, in these new EU members, but to a large extent, it was driven by FDI, which is fine as long as they can continue to attract FDI, and by the structural funds. And it's clear that the structural funds will be coming to end. And EU was already discussing that, in fact, there should be a new way of looking at structural funds, and they should not go to the poorest members or to the new EU members, but they should really be distributed based on crisis. So clearly Spain and Italy right now would be qualified as countries in crisis that, in the spirit of EU solidarity would be getting some kind of a support from European Union. It will really be interesting to follow how this corona crisis will change the EU functioning and principles. So now on the spending side, these are some of the outlays that the government finances. So education, health, that we find, as we said, national defense, every government will have item that covers some defense, social security, that is more in advanced economies. You do not find social security in budgets of very poor countries, very low income countries. Interesting item here is the net interest. Forget the other, that can be anything. But if you look at these first 5 and then the net interest, what is the difference between net interest and the other expenditures? The net interest actually is not doing anything for the welfare of the country, right? So the net interest is only reflects the interest rate that the government has to pay, the interest that the government has to pay on its own borrowing, either domestically to domestic borrowers or abroad. But when it comes to social welfare and fulfilling the allocative or redistributive or stabilizing function of public finance, net interest is not helpful at all. So when we want to look at the quality, for example, of the budget, we want to see, okay, these are the outlays, but we want to see how much of the expenditures are captured by non-productive expenses, such as net interest. And when we are at it, of course, we all know that budgetary deficit is, revenue minus expenditures, and it's a situation when the expenditures are higher than revenues. Is anyone familiar with the term primary fiscal deficit? So primary fiscal deficit is something that's much more used by policymakers. And when you will go on the website of International Monetary Fund and look at the item called there on the web data and under that World Economic Outlook, you will see that actually primary deficit is something that IMF includes for most countries that it analyzes, that it covers. So not only it will give you headline deficit, but also primary deficit, because again, for meeting the function, if we want to say, okay, how much stimulus is the country providing? So we had, for example, in the Czech Republic, the deficit for the next year in the budget has been increased 5 times, from 40 to 200. But it's not only size. What we want to know, how much of that deficit is financing real items, and right now obviously the health is the key priority, and how much of that deficit is simply on repaying interest rate. Now, Czech Republic is one of the lowest debts in the European Union, so it's not of a big problem, the interest rate payments. But among emerging market economies, for example, South Africa, the debt has been really accumulating so much, like it was 20% of GDP, 25% of GDP in 2008, it's almost 70% of GDP today. And with that, the net interest share of the expenditures went up tremendously. So we cannot just conclude because the ordinary headline deficit is high that right now South Africa is stimulating the economy. To a large extent, it's just repaying its debt. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about taxes. So quite important is the structure of the taxes. And here we talk about whether the tax rate is linear and constant when the income is changing, or whether the tax rate is rising with higher income, or whether the tax rate is falling with higher income. That actually brings us to some principle of taxation. So we have 2 key principles of taxation. There are quite a few, we will talk of them later, but maybe 2 to cover right now. It's called horizontal equity and vertical equity. Horizontal equity talks about equity, and you can think of it again about justice and fairness of taxation for people with the same income. So what do you think? How should government tax people with the same income so it meets some principle of fairness or it's referred to again, horizontal equity? How should the tax rate be for people with the same income?
Excuse me, what's the question?
So the question is, how should government tax people with the same income? And then to make it even clearer, should they be taxed at the same rate? So if you and I are working right now, obviously I am, but I know most students are also working. So we both are working, and suppose our monthly income is exactly the same. Should we be paying this? Should it be taxed at the same tax rate, or should it be taxed differently?
think if all of them, all of their income are the same, maybe they should be taxed equally.
Right, and that's the principle of horizontal equity, that people with the same income should be taxed at the same rate. Now, in practice, sometimes you actually do not see it. You find tax exemption. So for firms, for example, if a firm is operating in special zone, it may have some tax breaks relative to the firm that is not in the special zone. So that's violating the principle of horizontal equity. Or sometimes, you know, in some countries, people that have children or people that have special expenditures are taxed less. But usually as economists, we don't think that's the right way to go about it. So if people have special needs, that should be addressed directly by transfer. Taxation is too much of a blunt tool to be used for that. So according to horizontal equity, people, as you said, people with same income should be taxed at the same rate. Now we move to vertical equity. That's talking about how should people with different levels of income be taxed. So the question is, should people with high income be taxed at the same rate as people with low income, or should they be taxed differently?
So I think basically they should be taxed different because they have different income, and the higher income, the higher tax rate.
Right, and that's exactly how vertical equity is understood, that people with higher income should be taxed at higher rate. So here we can think of it as progressive taxation, that proportion of income paid in taxes rises as income rises. And actually most European EU countries have progressive system of taxation. And even Czech Republic, I mean, in Czech Republic, theoretically, we have the flat rate, 15%. But there are exemptions at very low income categories. So even in that seemingly linear system, there is actually progressivity. And but it's not as progressive tax system as other tax systems. Advantage of linear rate or flat rate, though, is its administrative efficiency. It's much easier to collect than, you know, very complicated tax system where basically tax administration has to check that whatever is reported is correct income. Now we can look a little further. Yeah, so here are examples of taxes, how they apply. So flat tax, if it's really for all incomes at the same rate, then, you know, that's proportional tax rate. Then we just talk about income tax, or sometimes estate taxes. The higher the income, the higher the estate, the higher the, not just the volume of tax, obviously, but tax rate. It's important to talk about tax rate. Now, why would VAT be example of a regressive tax? Can someone explain? Value added tax, why is it here put as a regressive tax? Because theoretically it has the same rate for everyone, right? I mean, I think in Austria it's 20%. I don't know what it's here, 18%. Anyway, it's some, or there are two categories, but anyway, it's same for everyone, right? When we're buying the goods, we pay the same VAT tax. As long as we buy the same good, we will pay the same VAT. Unless we travel abroad, etc. This exemption. So why is it here put into category of regressive tax?
Well, isn't it because if the household is poorer, then they spend more of their income just on consumption?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And on necessities, right? So they cannot really avoid the taxation. So when we look at what share of spending on food and basic household items are in the budget of very poor household and a very rich household, as you said, that's exactly right. The share is very different. So when we look at it relative to income, it's a highly regressive system. And here we again see, though, the trade-off between efficiency and equity. So it's not very equitable tax because it doesn't meet the vertical equity principle, but it's quite easy to collect. So in a lot of developing countries, there is a move to VAT because it is easier to collect. And also it's not hampering incentives of people to work. So when the government chooses to tax income, either income from employment or income from entrepreneurship or corporate tax, it's in some sense providing disincentives to participate in these activities, while VAT, that does not hamper economic activity. So let's talk just very quickly about principle of optimal taxation. We think taxation is optimal if it provides minimal space for people to avoid it or even evade it. So if activities are basically such that they are very inelastic, we say it would be optimal, to tax such activities. So from that point of view, it's much easier to tax necessities, right? Because people simply will always buy, as we saw now in the crisis, they will always buy toilet paper and they will always buy milk and some other basic items. And luxuries are much more flexible, if needed, people cut on them very quickly. So from that point of view, from the point of view of efficiency, the government should be taxing the necessities. But from the point of view of equity, obviously it should tax the luxuries, because that's where, the rich people, the richer households are spending more of their income. So again, another example of trade-off between efficiency and equity. So I think we already covered this: balanced budget, budget deficit, budget surplus. I think this is obvious. Now, interesting perhaps is that the government debt is the net, net balance. It's sum of all balances. So sum of all deficits and surpluses, sum of all balances over time amounts to government debt. But we should also say not only. In real life, this is good conceptually. In real life, there is another item. So if country borrows abroad, any fluctuation in exchange rate will actually impact the size of the debt. And it's called valuation change, but in case of severe, let's say, depreciation of the domestic currency, it can really severely impact the amount of debt relative to GDP, which is defined in domestic currency. But to start with, let's just say, okay, debt is a sum of balances, but don't forget about the other factors. So deficit and debt, where can government borrow? Government can borrow from individuals, corporations, financial institutions, and foreign entities or foreign governments. And of course, all more advanced economies, but now also many of the developing countries the governments are issuing so-called Eurobonds on international financial markets. To do that, usually it's required that they have credit rating. Otherwise, they will not access the financial markets, and certainly they will not access it at a reasonable price. So even, let's say, a country like, going back to Eswatini, has credit rating now, even though so far it has not issued any Eurobond. I think Uganda similar, it has credit rating, even though it has never issued. Botswana has never issued sovereign bond, but it has credit rating. By the way, the credit rating of Botswana is very close. It's, I think, identical as credit rating of Slovak Republic. So it has a very, very high credit rating relative to, its level of development, and it can access the financial markets on favorable terms. So here is just an example of a business cycle, and that's going back into, so we're finding ourselves somewhere here now. Let's say this was the 2008-9, and now we are here again. This time it's the government created recession. And it's showing us the long run trend in GDP and in some cases also long-run growth, depending, whether what trends we see in the growth. And then again, we have, on aggregate level, aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So by the way, the aggregate demand shows all the benefits to consumers. Aggregate demand represents all the costs to supplier. And then, of course, equilibrium price helps determine the consumer surplus and producer surplus. Now, two types of fiscal policies is particularly interesting in the current time. So we can have automatic fiscal policy and we can have discretionary fiscal policy. Automatic fiscal policy means that well-designed tax system and well-designed benefit system already has automatic stabilizers built in. So in case of mild recession or mild boom, government really does not need to do much. So example here would be of automatic stabilizer progressive taxation, because we know during boom, as the income goes up and more people are falling into the higher income category, automatically the tax rate will go up. So it's kind of hampering the incentive and bit slowing down the growth in the overheating phase. And similarly, when income is low, people fall into the low income category and they will pay less in taxes because of lower, not just tax volume, but importantly, tax rate. And unemployment benefit is another example. I was reading yesterday, it's really amazing that unemployment benefit claims in the US grew by 3,000%, over the last several months. So there's really a big hit that the economy is taking. So anyway, so in the overheating phase, in the boom, unemployment is very low. We can go back to the Czech Republic about a year ago, 2%. So expenditures, government expenditures on unemployment are very low, but they are rapidly bumped up in the face of recession. So these are automatic stabilizers. Now, more interestingly right now, and also during the last crisis in 2008 and 2009, we can talk about discretionary fiscal policy, right? And that's a situation where basically government goes and makes some deliberate changes to the current system. So example, in the Czech Republic of the government increasing the budget deficit so much because of the funding that's needed to small and medium enterprises, to consumers with their loan, all of that will be covered from budget, are responding to the crisis. Now, I'm sure there will be a lot of criticism because the package was put together quickly, but there is also kind of a trade-off between speed and nuances. So when it comes to stimulus packages, there are often 3 T's that should be applied. So the package should be timely. That means, it should be rolled out on time. It should be well targeted. So again, example of the US, if almost everyone gets $1,200, it's not well targeted, but again, government was responding quickly. So there is a trade-off between targeting and speed. And importantly, it should be time-bound. So there should also be plan how to roll back the package if needed. So in some case, there is a time limit. So when there is help of $1,200, it's only one-time help. It's not that every month or every half a year, households will be getting additional $1,200 from now on forever. So it's time-bound already. So let's now talk about expansionary and contractionary policy. So what type of policies right now government, as far as fiscal policy only we talk, what type of fiscal policy is government carrying out right now in the United States or in the Czech Republic? Pick a country you want to talk, but if it's country other than Czech Republic or United States that we already talked about, give us exact example and what measure you observe. So what policies are governments carrying out right now in the current situation? Fiscal policies.